Çatalhöyük excavation was a delight. It was a very important experience. Also because anthropology in Europe was so much in many places, not everywhere, certainly not in Britain, but in many places, anthropology, sociocultural anthropology drifted away from archaeology, and it became actually sometimes different faculties, housed in different faculties. Archaeology for a long time wasn't always regarded as a social science. And in that respect, that might be interesting to reflect a little bit back on how I got reacquainted with archaeology in Leiden when I arrived there. But basically, shortly after arriving in Leiden, where I succeeded Peter Geschire as the officially the professor in the Anthropology and Sociology of Modern Africa at that time. I was invited to this group of advisors, and we were particularly expected to, use our expertise in religion and in material culture to help the archaeologists to rethink their findings and to rearrange maybe lines of thought that they had. It was an amazing experience, not just because we were supposed to be part of this highbrow group with included these famous names, René Girard and Robert Bella and quite a number of others, whom I've never met because they never showed up, or at least not where I was. The thing went that the research grant by which we were we were enabled to come to Çatalhöyük, but also to Stanford, which by that time became the center from which the whole project was directed. It's a very international thing, right? It's amazing. The research money was spread over 3 years. So when after 3 years Ian Hodder did another grant, he could also change the group of advisors. And I was lucky enough to be kept on the team for another 2 sequences. So altogether I spent 9 years in a row there. And I think also it's fair to say that in every phase our interest started to shift. But you can imagine that, especially for someone like me, maybe less so for someone like Webb Keen, who was, grown up in an American context with the 4 fields, usually in one department of anthropology. But still, we both had, shocks of misrecognition, so to speak. Then things that we thought that we started whispering to each other. Said, "How can they say something about this? It's 10,000 years ago." Things like that. It's not just the huge difference, especially when you go back to a time when absolutely no cultural information can be conveyed directly except through material culture, through remains. But of course the other things were also interesting and important to reflect upon, and that, one of the things is that it taught me that we anthropologists, we were very much loners, right? People who did research on their own, who thought of the results on their own, who were actually in practice for most of the time real individualists. individual researchers who were also angry that about the fact, and sometimes justifiably so, that financing structures started to change, for instance, in the Netherlands, but also in other parts of Europe, that privileged large-scale projects. So that the situation that I was in when I had just graduated, that I could just write an application and stand a really good chance of getting the money, and being able to go on with my research for another 4 years, that completely evaporated in favor of a system where you supposedly build your career on cumulative projects that, maybe started out a little smaller when you just graduated, but then grew bigger in the next phase and even bigger in the next phase, so that, by that time you had to be recognized as a full professor. It should sort of follow in step with your. So the enlargement of scale that was to some extent logical in other contexts was by no means logical in the individualist world of the anthropological researcher. And I should say that there is another side to that I've only come to appreciate partly through the acquaintance with archaeologists, and that is that we should maybe rethink that individualist research practice, because we know by now that it's not self-evident that a male white anthropologist can represent other people's viewpoints equally adequately as people from other genders, other ethnicities, other backgrounds. Right? We've come to realize that diversity is not something that you simply generate by listening to people. It's something that has to be done, and that speaks for teams. It speaks for forms of collaboration that widen the definition of the researcher beyond that of the academic and the academically trained person. And this is very much something I learned from Ian Hodder, who was absolutely brilliant at that. Not only did the Çatalhöyük project very early on started to use, for example, the knowledge of the neighbors. Well, at first you maybe didn't expect that they would have any knowledge of a society that was in their place, but 10,000 years ago. They basically asked people in the village next to the village of Çatalhöyük, who were also partly their guides and did work in other respects for the excavation. How do you build houses? Because we dig up houses here, and we wonder what the technology behind it is. And they actually learned a lot from what these villagers could show them in the building of modern wattle structures. The most extreme example, which I of course appreciated extra because I had been dabbling in research into New Age phenomena, was that because of the previous reputation of the Çatalhöyük site, a group of especially American feminist New Agers came there annually to celebrate certain rituals for the mother goddess on the mound that was being excavated. And again, Ian was very hospitable to them. He allowed them to come, allowed them to do their ritual, engage in discussion with them. But of course, because the findings that persuaded these groups to come and celebrate their own spirituality in Çatalhöyük were increasingly scarce, right? There was very little found of the mother goddess anymore. So they became increasingly critical of the project, and but it extended to a lot of different things, including the fact that at a certain point I think it was the second time I went, my partner and I decided to also have a bit of a holiday in Turkey, and you know, a place like Istanbul is fantastic. So we combined that, and she asked Ian, you know, do you mind if I tag along with what happened there? You should imagine we got there in the nearby city of Konya. Then we were brought over every day to the excavation, basically to tour the excavation or the different parts of the excavation. There are actually multiple sites. Together with Ian and the archaeologist in charge of that particular part, who would then tell us something about what happened, and then we had the chance to talk also with the different sections of archaeologists who were processing materials. You know, this is an operation that is so complex that no simple ethnographic fieldwork can compare with it. Right, you had a section for human remains, you had a section for pottery, you had a section for lithics, right? So all these different aspects of things that were dug up, and you know, people had to talk with each other about, you know, what does this structure actually mean? Also, given what we find there. So we, you know, a week was basically rarely enough, but we spent a week being sort of guided along those new findings. And Anke, my partner, was again hospitably allowed to tag along, to such an extent that when we returned for the second series of 3 years, and she came along again, and started to say a few things during the conferences at the site, Ian said, "Can't you write that up?" Right. So she also, while she, you know, she wasn't officially engaged with the excavation at all. Of course, I was being paid for it by travel money and you know, the travel and accommodation. It's another example of the way in which Ian Hodder taught me a lot about the value of collaboration, and that seeking out understandings that you wouldn't have predicted yourself, or you wouldn't have expected to generate a contribution to your own work. And that's been with me ever since, and I think it's still changing my conception of anthropology as well. Also, given the importance of collaboration and again also ethics, right? Because you know, by definition, anthropology or ethnography is an intersubjective enterprise. Right? You need the ideas and the knowledge of other people if you are to generate knowledge. But things become much more ethically defensible once you continuously interpret that as a collaboration, as something that consists of diversity, and that maybe ought to remain diverse if you want to maintain the legitimacy of your project, right? So it all means that maybe we've been making a little bit too much of a hero out of the ethnographer. And here I have to think immediately of the introduction to Argonauts of the Western Pacific, where the ethnographer is spelled with a capital E. I think my much admired ancestor, Bronislaw Malinowski, saw himself a little bit as his own hero, and that is something we should be skeptical of nowadays. Although I still, like I said, I still have a lot of admiration for him. To come back to the archaeologists and the archaeological excavation, so this was at least partly a discovery of a different style of working, of a much more complex style of working, which almost by definition also implies a mastery of methods and methodology that is so much more extensive than what you're used to in an ethnographic situation. That changes your mind. I think Lynn Meskel sometimes found it nice to rub my nose in that fact, and we are mythologically way ahead of you, Guy. So that's. But there were also strange things. Like I said, I was sometimes whispering with Webb Keen in the first year or two, with amazement at the facility with which archaeologists could leap over centuries in the way they drew conclusions. And this, in fact, became one of my core interests. And it culminated in two essays that I'm still quite proud of. One is not so famous, the other is. One is an essay called Temporalities of Religion in Çatalhöyük, with religion between inverted commas. Because, of course, how can we apply a concept that was invented in the current meaning in the 19th century to something 10,000 years ago? There's little reason to assume that it fits. And that, of course, was immediately a problem for the whole project, because Templeton paid for research or advice on religion. So I found a lot of the thinking about religion that was put into that project. And this particularly concerned these ideas by René Girard, right, about scapegoats and I thought these were sort of ready-made Christian concepts that then were projected back onto something in which the whole notion of Judaism was still to arise. So it made us whisper together: how can they do that, right? How can you leap across those centuries by means of those ready-made theories that, as far as we were concerned, far too much resemble the idea of some kind of natural law. Right? This is valid for all human societies. We didn't buy that one. We were too much, die-hard historical ethnographers to believe in the possibility of that. And yet, of course, you realize you had to do something with that kind of material. And with the problem of not knowing more than what you found in the excavation. And this particular essay, what I tried to do is, first of all, to distinguish a number of temporal scales, and then to apply it to one of the aspects of the Çatalhöyük excavation that seemed to be closest to something sacred. And that was the house itself. Because what you found, what was really surprising, was that if you follow the floor plans, you realize that many houses were demolished and built up exactly in the same floor plan. Almost exactly. Sometimes there were slight differences, and this could go on for several generations of houses, which most probably also went, each house, physical house, before it was demolished, may also have been older than one generation. So more than one generation lived in a house, then it was demolished, then it was put up again in the same form, and you could see that people still remembered what were central symbolic spots in the house in the previous layers. So there seemed to be a kind of sacredness about that house that was clearly transcending over human generations, and that had to be reproduced in a certain way. And so my essay tried to think about that, but also to think about how these different scales of temporal interaction, daily reproduction, seasonal reproduction, annual cycle, seasonal cycles are annual, obviously. Also longer-term cycles of family reproduction, right? When people growing old, children getting born, taking over adult responsibilities, all those kinds of things. and to all of that, to relate all of that to the kind of material data that seemed to be certain, which in the first case clearly indicated that the house was something more important than the person or the individual, and that it therefore was reasonable to say that something comparable to religion was taking place around the house in Çatalhöyük. And that was by itself important because these were one of the first places in that whole region where people start to build rectangular houses, right? And it was in an evolution also from dwellings in caves and sort of ready-made places where you would be dry and safe, to places that you would construct yourself with a community. So that was the other essay that became, a big hit. But that was because it was co-authored with Ian Hodder. It was called History Houses, and it shows you a little bit of the same kind of idea. It became especially popular among archaeologists because. It's an example of how Ian responds to new ideas, because he insisted that was my idea, to call it History Houses, and he asked whether we couldn't write it up together. So it appeared in the same volume. What it did for me was to teach me much more about the importance of time in thinking about social arrangements. And if you then go back to the critical anthropological side of things, you can see why that is so crucial. Because one of the things that people very often tended to forget until quite recently, and I mean by that, say 10, maybe 12 years ago. Well, no, that's not true. It's a little longer than that. But the real realization how the importance of time comes back. In fact, in the critique of anthropology that Johannes Fabian formulated in Time and the Other, right, where he said anthropologists use ways of phrasing and thinking that either implicitly or explicitly place people in another time. And I came to realize another variety of that argument, which was actually formulated later on by, among others, Arjuna Padarai, said that anthropology was for a long time not the kind of social science that you associate with the future, right? The future, that was what economists and sociologists did, right? They said, this is where we're going. And the we was clearly implicitly we moderns, right? And in that whole constellation of social sciences, it was quite clear that the people that anthropologists were dealing with were not assumed to have a future. Just as in many cases, Native Americans, indigenous peoples in general, were regarded as people in an extinction condition, right? Just as most ethnographic museums were founded on the extinction condition, right? So they denied many of the people that they were studying, we denied many of the people that we were studying a future. And interesting enough, when you do that, and I later wrote an essay about it, my second essay that was published in Current Anthropology in 2015, I think that is impossible to think without my archaeological experience with the archaeologists and trying to master thinking about, such enormous leaps of time, and trying to bring it back to something I could handle as an anthropologist, and I could actually place in relation to the excavation. The time scales are so important to incorporate, to keep in your research materials to keep in your consciousness, because basically there is no society without a past or without a future. Everybody is, the people are defined by their movement in time, right? They are always on their way to something. They are growing up, they are growing old, they're being initiated to become someone else, to become another person, the kind of person that the society finds desirable, so the kind of future that the society has formulated for someone. And that happens everywhere and still all the time in the world. And for some strange reason, when you go back to some of the classics, you see that aspect of having a future being denied. And that's the essay I published in 2015, identifies that with certain specific authors, Malinowski, Lévi-Strauss, some others, and gives an argument for having a thriving anthropology of the future. And interestingly, ironically enough, I think I learned that from the engagement with the past of the archaeologists. So.